Megabytes, terabytes, kilobytes, anything with the word byte, we have to thank Claude Shannon and Warren Weaver. They invented that term in 1949 as part of work to figure out how can they make telephone switching, which in the past used to take, when somebody would make a call, they would pull it out of a switch and then stick it to a different switch to connect somebody. That manual process just wasn't going to work. They needed to figure out something different, something new, something that's possible. Without that word byte, we wouldn't have telecommunications, and then therefore we wouldn't have the internet. Now, why am I introducing this concept? In order for us to scale valuable relationships, we're going to have to deal with some terminology and figure things out in order to be able to repeat it. And it's just different. It's not complicated. It's not overly complex. It's rules that we need to be able to scale that. Hi, I'm Scott Santucci. I'm the President and Chief Growth Catalyst for Growth Enablement Ecosystems. This particular video, we're going to cover some basics, and specifically, our fundamental focus is on building economically valuable business relationships between us and our customers. In order for us to do that, we have to make sure that it's simple and introduce some simple principles to help us introduce new ideas and new concepts in order for this to scale. One of those new concepts is this idea of a relationship rhythm. And we're going to introduce that as a foundation to be able to scale that. Why does this matter? Well, simply put, if you're moving from a business model where you're talking about yourselves and products and services to your customers, flipping that around and working in an environment where you're working backwards from customers on how to help them realize business outcomes, this is a big shift. And we need to have some tools, because in order for us to make this big shift work, we have to do this in concert with a lot of different individuals. So let's get started by really zooming in on the simplicity of what sales actually is. And sales has been around since as long as the dawn of man. But simply put, a buyer has two objectives. They either have a problem that they don't know how to solve, or they have an idea of something that they want. They go to the market, and in the market, they find an individual. So a market is a really abstract thing. Markets don't write checks, people do. And the buyer is going to get specific things from an individual. Those specific things that they're going to get, they're either going to get ideas of how to solve problems, or they're going to get puzzle pieces to fit what they're looking for. The interactions between the two is an exchange. It's an exchange of information that you have as a seller for money that they have willing to either solve their problem or give them their need. Now, as simple as that is, and most of the design points that we have for sales predicate on an individual conversation with an individual. The reality of today in 2019 is that buyers really are collections of many different people, since we're selling to businesses. And our seller isn't the only person involved. They're not the only client-facing individual. We have many other people, and we have other folks involved in that process. Because companies don't have a construct to be able to coordinate all of this stuff, all of the people involved on the seller side and also all of the people involved on the buyer side, what happens is we get too much complexity or confusion. So what makes it complicated? Why is there so many different moving parts? Well, the first thing is we need to understand what the definition of complex and complicated are. What we're talking about here is the thing that I think all of us can recognize with is ordering an Uber or getting an Uber is a very simple, easy process. The act of getting a car to you at that moment in time is incredibly complex. It involves satellites, it involves a whole bunch of mobility, it involves a whole bunch of coding. And what Uber has done is they have factored in all the complex factors, designed out the complicatedness to make it simple for us. In contrast, what makes something complicated What makes something complicated is when you have a lot of different steps in an unnecessary way. In this particular example, this is a Rube Goldberg this is a Rube Goldberg diagram to cool your soup. And as you can see, instead of just blowing on the soup, there's a whole bunch of intricate processes involved. Complicated is overdoing something. Complex and making something simple is realizing and working backwards from the complexity. Design is what makes something simple, the design. And that's what we don't do in sales and marketing today, is design what it is that we're actually looking for. So therefore, we don't make things simple. So an example, a root cause of what makes it complicated or the lack of design is, let's say, using the example of buyers having two different things. One is that they're looking for a widget. They have an expressed need. So they go to the market, they find a seller who's got a widget for them, the right benefits or services. But what if that seller, doing what a lot of our companies are telling them to do, actually tries to communicate with that particular buyer about new ideas of how to work? That's going to create lots and lots and lots of confusion, because the mindset of both of these individuals couldn't be further. The same thing is true if the buyer has a business problem and the seller introduces what their products and services are, assuming that the buyer is going to figure it out. That process of figuring it out is something that the buyer just isn't going to be prepared to do. So it also starts with the seller introducing that and trying to talk to a customer that doesn't even envision a problem. Or having a seller, you've got a new vision that you want to go and communicate to, and you are engaging with buyers who only are thinking about in terms of buying individual needs. The point is, all of that stuff is complex. And in order for us to manage it out, we have to look that sales is actually a communications process. That communication process has a couple of different key elements. And this is why I started with Shannon and Moore. You can go and read their work. It's called A Mathematical Theory of Communications. But essentially, the components of it, if you have an audience, that audience has a goal, a message, or objective. We have a messenger as part of that delivery mechanism. We have messages that we're communicating. So all of these different elements are complex because it has a lot of moving parts. Let's diagram out all the different moving parts. On the audience side, remember, it's not just one person involved in that decision. Some of the people involved in the decision might have a problem. They don't get it. Other people might know for sure what's involved. And there's a lot of different people who have different points of view. Going back on your side, there's a whole bunch of people inside your company who have different ideas of what your message is. And you have different messengers who either want to communicate to problems or ideas, or want to communicate to solutions. And because all of these different people don't have a common song sheet to sing from, you get this chaos at the point of sale, which makes that interaction between the seller and the buyer very frustrating. What makes it complicated is that companies have the wrong design point. Well, so what do we mean by that? Is ultimately, this is a system. And the system says there's a lot of different people on the green side, the buyer side, and there's going to be a primary person of whom you are interacting with is the interface point. Going over to the blue, there's a primary interface point, your seller, and they have a lot of folks to navigate to. So the challenge is, what actually is the design point of this particular system, and how do we make it thrive? Well, the design point really we have to zoom into that conversation part and factor in two things. One is we want to make sure each of the different interactions that a seller has with a buyer are value added. The second thing is those individual interactions over time create a relationship. So we have to be able to plot out time, and we have to understand what is the overarching objective of all of these particular initiatives. What is the customer's expectation? So how do we design it to be simple? Well, the first thing that we need to be able to recognize is that today, the easy thing to do would be to concentrate in each of our different silos. Human resources people saying, hey, we're going to design a learning program, or marketing saying we're going to design a demand generation program, or sales operations saying we're going to design a sales process, or sales enablement people saying we're going to design a onboarding program. The point is we're concentrating on the stuff. What would make all of this simple is if we were to work backwards from what is the conversation that's required, and factoring in all of the human elements, the behaviors, and all of the different people involved to orchestrate all of that activity. So in order for us to understand how to design things to be easy for our customers and to work backwards from that, we need a way to really understand what is the nucleus and the focal point of what contributes to value. What is the value of a seller to a buyer? One of the ways that we can do that is recognize that the value that we offer is to eliminate that chaos, that lack of confusion. What this grid is a value perception grid based on that idea. Is we're going to design out that complexity. There are two dimensions of this complexity. One dimension is the number of attributes or variables the client needs to consider in order to solve their problem or meet their objective. So for example, if they have an express need, guess what? The number of variables involved is going to be few. The second thing, the second dimension, the bottom dimension, is the amount of knowledge transfer required. And that knowledge transfer required is also either, hey, we know how to do this, AKA buy a widget, or we don't know how to do it. We don't even know where to start solving our problem. So it's either one or the other. And each one of these different things highlight a different scenario. So what makes communications valuable to buyers? Well, let's start figuring out what is their expectation of us. And the expectation comes down to how do we pattern out the type of buyers based on these different scenarios. So in this case, this is not a lot of variables to consider, not a lot of knowledge transfer type buying decision. It really doesn't matter what it is. The likelihood is this is a decision that's going to get passed to a procurement type person. Their objective is just to complete a task. So that's the expectation that they have, is that you're going to give them the information that they need, that they want, in order to go home quickly. On their part, there's not a lot of stakeholders involved. The budget's already been approved. Really what it comes down to is acquiring the capabilities at the lowest cost. That's it. If we overcomplicate it, we're not valuable. If you're dealing with a scenario where there's a lot of variables involved, but not a lot of knowledge transfer, well, what the client is after is really, what we want to do is we want to cut the overall spend, but not our service. An example of this would be if you have 6 different companies who are providing you computers or devices, to consolidate all of that spend under one provider that's got a broad reach is going to save the client, the customer, lots of money. They're going to have sort of one-stop shop. But that one vendor who gets all of the business is also going to benefit. So the overall service that's provided to the company is not affected. The spend level is. So that's a different pattern. In that scenario, there's going to be more stakeholders involved, but still it's under the guise of approved budgets. When we start moving from the left side, where the client pretty much knows what they're looking for, knows how to do it, to the right side, which is really what the premise of this whole program is about, or what's possible selling, your customers don't know what they're doing. And I'm going to repeat that. Your customers do not know what they're doing. An individual may, but their whole system, all the people involved aren't. In this particular scenario, not a lot of variables to consider, but massive amounts of knowledge transfer. This is going to be a decider pattern. What are they looking to do? They're looking to solve that problem. They need that insight. The number of people involved now explodes. Look at how many different folks are involved, because they're going to, in order for them to move forward, they're going to have to reduce the risk involved. So they're going to get other peers involved. They're probably going to have to go find budget for it, because it's probably unbudgeted, because if it were budgeted, they would know how to solve the problem. They would be able to go get their own budgets. So figuring out, hey, we've got this business problem that's negatively impacting us, it's unlikely they've got all their budgeting figured out. They're going to need to get buy-in from lots and lots of people who are going to resist the change, who love the way things are working forward, and they're going to want to get executive level sponsorship. When you go and look at the next pattern, the lots of activities to consider and also a lot of knowledge transfer, really what you're looking at is generating results. And this is more akin to a business transformation effort where you have to fix the plane while it's flying. And boy, pretty much large pockets of the company are involved, ranging from leaders, functional heads, to sharing and pooling budgets and rethinking budgeting, gaining buy-in and acceptance. And it's just a massive scale and a massive amount of work. But the point is, there's very clear patterns, and each one of these patterns can be modeled, and each one of these patterns are predictable. No matter what it is that's being purchased, they all fit similar rules because the goals are the expectations of how you can add value is very simple. So that's what we can do as a design point. So what makes this communications process so doggone complicated? Well, let's go back, and we've talked about this as a value communications process. We've already identified that there's essentially 4 buyer types who each have different expectations. Well, let's zoom in and concentrate on the buyer type that we're building out, which is the designer buyer type. Well, if we don't have a common design point and our messages, because the best practice today is to build messaging around our products and services, guess what? Our messaging is probably going to be in that lower, the lower left box. And let's say that we want to deploy our sellers, and we're thinking in terms of sales, deploying our sales force based on economics. And one of the things that we want to do is we want to have a coverage model where we have named accounts. Well, in this particular situation, and not factoring in that we're also trying to sell to deciders, the spec of who we're building as a sales force fits that mode. Then on top of that, instead of designing an engagement strategy with our customers to be bidirectional, we've got a push mode where we have messages that we're just building out and just creating more and more stuff of. We have sellers throwing stuff at the wall at our clients. So what happens is all of this push information that isn't scoped out just doesn't land. And it's not landing because we're targeting different elements. So we're not even getting the economies of scale, and we're creating friction between our messages and our messengers. But on top of that, both of those are missing the mark. So if you add up all the money that we spent on the messengers, spent on the money on the message, and all the technology that we did pushing it out, really our net value add is almost zero because we're not communicating. We don't have the right information or communication strategy. Okay, so what does that look like? What makes communication simple? What makes communication simple is basically making sure that these things align. And we already know that we have different buyer types. How do we make sure that we have the right communication strategy for each one of those boxes checked off? The negotiator type, we want to make sure that we find the right negotiator buyer. The messaging strategy for the negotiator buyer better be, just the facts, and our messengers better be quick, because that particular cadence or relationship style requires all those, and we can communicate the dots, we can satisfy the expectations of that relationship. And it goes on. For the aggregator, we want to connect the dots. For the decider, the one that we're going to focus on, connect the dots. For the driver, we'll connect the dots. Now we have to make sure that we design. So we've got our components. So we've got what kind of buyer type that we need, what kind of messaging strategy that we have, what kind of seller strategy that we have. How do we make sure, design in, that relationships are reciprocal? And reciprocal is a really tough concept if you try to talk about it in an abstract, and it's a really easy construct when we strip away all the knowing and just relating with individual people. And really what it comes down to is a reciprocal relationship has feedback. And the way that I like to characterize it is the black and red signals of an electrical current, the black being a positive charge, the red being a negative charge. And the reason that that's important is because in that flow, a light bulb doesn't go off unless you complete the circuit. Once you take the red wire off, the light bulb doesn't light. And that's really the crux of it here is if we have a customer who has a problem that they don't know what it is, and we have an insight, we have to have a design point of organized bidirectional information exchange, or else the light bulb isn't going to go off. And if we want to be able to create chaos, a sure way to create chaos is to keep pushing more and more information onto a client who's confused. All that's going to do is agitate them. And we're going to create a lot of waste because we really don't know what our design point actually is. So, different relationships have different rhythms. What actually is a rhythm? Well, the way that I like to think about this is a very simple metaphor. Sound. Think about sounds. Sounds with rhythm is music. Sounds without rhythm is noise. Fundamentally simple concept. When you factor in the business relationships that we have with different clients, they are going to be tuned to different relationships or tempos. So you can imagine a response. If we have a client who wants to just complete a task, we better get to the point fast. Right to the point fast. Right to the point fast. So our tempo is going to be responsive, but it's also going to be speed driven. An economy of rhythm is going to have its own cadence and tempo. We're not going to talk about that. When we talk about a prescriptive rhythm, the cadence has to be different. We have to let it breathe a little bit. The tempo has to be a little bit slower, more fluid, give and take, breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, breathe out, because our sponsor is going to be learning. Then they're going to be learning, hey, how likely is my own company going to be to buy in it? What kind of internal selling that I have to do? How we're going to go about being successful? So there's a lot of give and take that's required. And if we impose measures and a cadence to that rhythm that doesn't match the cadence and the breathing rhythm that's required for the desire to be successful, we're going to not make a connection in a valuable connection. And we're going to get more and more of those situations where the buyers say 84% of the sellers show up with an agenda that it's about them. So that's what we have to be able to do, is recognize what is the rhythm for each one of these different situations. So we have a responsive rhythm that's tuned very, very fast. We have an accommodative rhythm, which is tuned about being much more flexible on your part to be able to configure the right components. A prescriptive rhythm to get to the way that we can help our clients see what's possible, help them engage and understand and appreciate what's possible, and then help get them to buy in. And then there's a performance rhythm where we're woven into the fabric of our clients. We're focusing on this prescriptive rhythm. So how do you design the components of a relationship rhythm? This sounds, very sciencey and philosophical, but it's not. It's really easy when we make it easy. The simplicity here is to first start with model. And at the first level of model, your instinct is you're going to want to do a lot of stuff, but really just pick out of these 4 different boxes, who is the type that you're after. So then you can go back and check and say, all right, we're in the prescriptive method. Do we have an overall message, an overarching message strategy that helps our clients envision what that outcome is? Where's the architecture or the things that roll it up? Do we have a thoughtfulness in all of the material that we create? And then ultimately, what kind of sellers do we need? Because our sellers have to add value to it. In this particular way to complete the circuit is a decider needs thoughtful messaging delivered to them by a specialist. So what kind of training are we giving our salespeople to actually be specialists in what? Those are the questions that we need to design for. So how do we measure the tempo of the value exchange? As you can imagine, the tempo, the beat of a waltz is different than the beat of the tango. Each of the different types or dances are going to have a different tempo. How do we map that out? Well, that's actually very straightforward and simple as well. No matter what you do, the interactions are going to happen over a period of time. So remember our design point, we're building a relationship over time. The goal, the expectation of our decider audience type here is they want to solve problems. In order for us to make sure that our thoughtful content and our specialists are targeted enough in order to help them solve problems, we first need to understand the P. The P really is who are our target stakeholders that we're after. I didn't say personas, I said stakeholders because these are knowable. If we're really clear on knowing what business problem that we're looking to address and what outcomes we can make possible for our clients, we should be able to know who we want to have as our primary contact. So let's make a list of all of the companies that we've got and who our primary contact is. Once we know that, great. The next thing that we're going to need to be able to do is have meetings with those contacts. The next thing that we're going to need to be able to do is have those meetings be successful and have them agree to say, hey, what you said makes sense. Your thoughtfulness makes sense to me. We're going to explore it further. The next thing is that they have a shared vision inside their organization of what that looks like. And finally, we need to agree on what a business relationship looks like or what the business case looks like. This is it. This is how we tune the cadence of what our relationship are. What we want to be able to do is focus on what information that we need to complete each one of these 5 objectives. So how do we start putting this together? And the metaphor to really think about this is it's no different than sheet music or a construction blueprint. We as human beings have figured out how to do this before. And it probably seems super complicated at first, but when you start doing it, it's way, way, way easier. So let's just avoid the pushback because it's different and just recognize that this is actually simple because other people do it. So what is our goal? Our goal is that we want to design for valuable business relationships. Well, how is this like music or construction? Well, one of the things that we want to be able to do is we're trying to create a construct, and I'm using sort of the metaphor, an adapted metaphor of sheet music. And the first thing that we want to do is what are we tuning our relationship to? So if you think about the analogy of how it's similar, in sheet music, where you're tuning it to is they're factoring in the notes, they're factoring in time, and they're factoring in the instruments. When you go and look at a blueprint of making this bike, what you do is you're factoring in the parts, you're factoring in where the parts fit, and you're factoring in the sequence of events of how to assemble the parts. So these are the things that we're tuning to. What are we tuning things to? The next thing that we're going to do is how would we measure it? How does a orchestra or a conductor measure the rate? Well, they have a tempo meter to be able to measure. How does a construction group measure their productivity? They have a ton of metrics and tools to be able to do that. We don't have any, so we have to make them up. And how do you scale it? How do you make it repeatable? All 3 of these things are common. The music industry figure out how to measure by, tune to, and scale by. The manufacturing world of assembling products, tune to, measure by, scale by. These are things that we have to be able to do too. So if that is the analogy and that this is doable because it's doable in music and long-haired heroin addicts can write and record sheet music and make things repeatable, certainly we can too. What are we after? So let's concentrate on what we're tuned to. That idea of a relationship rhythm that we already shared with, boom, we already have the components of what to tune to already. The reason that we have these graphics is provide the notation for it, boom, interoperable. It's very simple. I'm not saying it's easy. The learning curve is challenging, but once you get it, if you keep it simple, it's simple. So now what we want to do is we want to concentrate on measurement. Let's talk about measurement here because it can get very complex when we think about it differently. What we're doing is we're actually measuring a flow. So what we have to be able to do is we have to take, for example, so I shared our selling objectives here. take that and use those as inputs, and we're making sure that we're collecting the information of the measured by from these 5 objectives. Now, you can take information from other sources, but that's going to be less indicative of what we're after. Keep in mind, we're about building valuable relationships. We're not about managing salespeople's time. That's a byproduct and something else. So when we want to measure by and want to measure business results, we want to look at, first and foremost, productivity. And what's productivity comprised of? It's comprised of how effective we are and how efficient we are. And how do we manage those to be more effective? We need to make sure that our metric categories roll up into these simple buckets and are leveraging this information. So that's simple. Now, how do we scale all this stuff? Is we scale all this stuff by having a very solid knowledge management strategy. How do we take the thoughtfulness information that we've got? How do we transfer and decide what of that information can be encoded in documents, what can be encoded in video, and what needs to be trained to our sellers? Then when we think about it, is what exactly is the specialization that we're developing for our sellers? So we simplify that. And also, what is the information and how will our customers be able to digest it? Now, I know that you're going to think maybe that's overwhelming and we're talking about building individual assets for each individual person. That's not what we're talking about at all. What we're talking about is how do we have a strategy to pull it all together? The strategy of how you conduct and manage a symphony orchestra is very different than how Rush conducts itself with a 3-man band. So to make this all simple and make this all fit together, it's really, really, really straightforward. I shared all those different components to say these are the design elements that factor in. Now, factoring in design thinking, complex adaptive theory, all of these different things, here's the spec of what's possible relationship rhythm. First is we find the prescriptive relationship rhythm, and we map that out. These parts are knowable, and it provides us what we're tuning to already. What are we measuring by? Well, we want productivity. Productivity is really about the size of profitable contracts that we're getting from these relationships. And also in terms of efficiency, we need to be improving the workflow of meeting the objectives. What are those objectives? Did we get at bats with the right stakeholder that we're after? In those at bats, did we have successful meetings? So on and so forth. It's how well are we manufacturing those sales objectives? That's it. Nothing else is more important. And then finally, a knowledge management strategy for this kind of scenario is actually the knowledge management strategy that is the oldest and something that we as human beings know innately how to do. And really, it's a hero's journey. It's the fireside chat of telling a heroic story, and that's how we encode a lot of information in these hero story metaphors. So we scale this by scripting out what that story is, so making sure that our production is in alignment, and execution. And we have whole industries, whether it be the publishing industry or the movie industry, which we can leverage these things for. So the key point of bringing this all together is that we need very simple measures, having a metric of managing our sales force by focusing on its productivity to produce sizable, profitable contracts with our customers, and our focus is also improving the workflow of meeting those objectives, will make everybody in that system happy. It makes your customers happy, the individual people happy, it makes your sellers happy because their workload becomes better, and it makes the marketers or anybody who's in the support role happy because they see their work being used. The tuning part is a overlay because you have to recognize that your current mindset is to think about sales and marketing as separate resources. You need a way to bring everybody together and design a role in for everybody. The prescriptive relationship rhythm, or any relationship rhythm for that matter, factors in and defines roles for every type involved and coordinates those roles. You can subdefine roles based on the number of individuals, but this is what's important. And you need this as an overlay to how you're currently organized. And then finally, the scale by is You can go do a whole bunch of research on knowledge management theory. At the end of the day, let's just take what we already know, and it's about telling stories. So these are the three components that are important. We're going to talk next about how to bring this all together. So what did we share with you? Design is critical, and it requires discipline. So we walked through a lot of those different discipline elements that hopefully you'll refer to and stay focused on. The design point is the rhythm of the conversation. If we don't get that right, we don't get the coordination, and we create friction between our sellers and our buyers. Relationship rhythms can actually be designed. That's amazing. So what this allows you to do is allows you to actually shift gears to be able to do it. Yes, it's going to take a little bit of time to get comfortable with it, but once you get comfortable with it, you can really start to make incredible strides in terms of reducing the amount of workload that you have as a team, increasing the output, and more importantly, making your customers happy. Thank you very much for your time. I look forward to getting your feedback.